All right, it's 10 o'clock, so we're going to get started. Welcome to today's Cook Connect on zero waste cooking, preventing food waste. My name's Alice. You've seen me here a couple of times before, but I'm the Digital Dining Services. Um, and today's basically going to be a continuation of last week's conversation, kind of more specific in terms of cooking and preventing food waste and how that ties into being or trying to be zero waste. And again, with kind of every presentation I've done, feel free to chime in opinions and comments and other tips from your own perspective during the presentation and share it with everybody else. And I'll try to remember to read those during the presentation, but if not, I'll get to them at the end. So starting off, I'm just going to present a few quick facts about food waste. And there are a number of sources that I get these from, and a lot of it varies based on what organization you look at, and kind of global estimations versus U.S. estimations vary quite a bit. Because it's something that's very hard to estimate, right? How much food do we throw away? So the USDA number estimates around 31 to 40% of food in the US is wasted. Some numbers you may see are a little bit higher globally, some say 50%. And some of that is going to be from, it's basically the waste that comes from farm, from production to our fork or to our tables, right? So that's the total. And some of that is going to be, from losses due to crops not succeeding success totally, or the farmers or producers may throw stuff away, or the grocery stores may throw a few things away. Like you see this ugly kind of quote unquote ugly pepper here that some stores, more conventional grocery stores, may throw away because it doesn't look like the perfect pepper, where some other stores like the farmer's market or like a co-op grocery store may keep that, and that's what I usually buy at the grocery store. It's kind of the uglier fruits and vegetables. So some of that is part of that number, but more than half of it, it's estimated, comes from the consumer level. So that's the stuff we're taking home. So if you picture yourself, bringing home a couple of grocery bags full of groceries, let's say you bring home 4, you're probably dropping around or like losing about one of those bags out of the 4, about 25% of what you buy due to waste. And most of that's going to be fruits and vegetables, right? Which I don't think anyone's going to be surprised about. Fruits and vegetables, they go bad easily. Sometimes we don't know how to use them if we're getting them from gardens or farmers markets, and we get very excited about buying them and aren't sure quite how to use them. And sometimes we forget about them because they're usually at the very bottom of our refrigerators or packed away somewhere, in the freezer, things like that. And there's some websites here about where to find some more data, but that's just a few quick little data points. A few other ones on how it impacts us. I think the term waste kind of resonates with a lot of people, right? If we're wasting something, we're essentially wasting the resources used to produce it, right? And so in the case of food, we're wasting water, right? It takes water to grow things. It takes, over 1,000 gallons of water to produce a pound of beef. It takes, a lot of acres of land to raise cattle or raise crops to feed cattle, or, raise, produce in general. And then it requires energy inputs, our own energy, the labor of farm workers or other kind of in that field. So a lot of resources wasted, right, when we throw away food. And then on a more personal note, it wastes also, money. So it's estimated we're wasting about $144 billion per year in the US just on the food that we throw away. And then on the more of an output end, right, and kind of the last effect is the environmental effect. So when food goes to the landfill, it takes up volume, right? It doesn't decompose completely because it doesn't have the perfect conditions to decompose like it would if we do it, in compost or in a garden. Or so it takes around, a fifth of our landfill volume. And then the food, because it's not in its ideal condition when it's in a landfill, starts producing greenhouse gases because it's kind of trapped. There's no way for it to get oxygen and the things it needs to decompose kind of most efficiently. And so it'll produce a greenhouse gas as a byproduct or as a result of that. And so food waste, it's estimated, is responsible for about 8% of our greenhouse gas emission. And then lastly, I think a lot, if you grew up kind of in the same kind of household that I did, you were always told not to waste food because there are children out there who are starving. And I'm not totally a fan of that kind of mentality, but in that same sense, we're throwing away food when there's a lot of food insecurity in the world, in other countries, also especially in this area as well. And so that also kind of impacts or is related to food waste. So why do we throw away food, right? And feel free to at this point throw in some examples of why you have thrown away food. We all kind of do it, right? Inadvertently throw away food. Why do we throw away food? what kinds of foods do we throw away, right? It varies based on person, definitely varies for me, and I do try my best not to throw away food, but sometimes it just inevitably happens. I'm not sure what kinds of foods you all throw away, but typically for me, every now and then I'll get, produce that looks great in the market, but is not great. It's like it's avocado. Or sometimes I'll make something on my own, like kombucha, and it'll go moldy, so I'll throw that away. So it's a number of reasons. Some of it may be things that have gone stale, hiding in the back of the fridge. I wrote, right. Sometimes I'll go through this tip later, but I will go through my fridge every now and then just to move things around so I don't forget about things, right? So sometimes people purchase or made too much. Sometimes you go to the store and you're like, oh, this looks so good, I should buy it. But then you forget about it, or you just don't know how to use it, or you just make too much of something and don't want to eat it for leftovers again. Quality, sometimes, again, you buy things and they're just not great out of the grocery store. Sometimes you make things and they don't taste good. And so, most of the time I'll just eat it. But sometimes you really have to set a level to, I can't eat this. It's not great at all. Byproducts, sometimes we throw away things like, this isn't as common nowadays, I think, with the sourdough craze, right? But a lot of times people will throw away their sourdough starter that they have to mix, how you have to feed it, and throw away some of it. And instead of using it, some people do throw it away because they don't know how to use it. And that's less common nowadays, I feel like, with all this education that's going on, which is great. This is actually a sourdough discard chocolate cake I made. It's pretty good. So being able to use byproducts of things like that, or like things like beet greens, right? I've never actually eaten beet greens prior to this year, because normally when I buy them from the store, they come with the greens already taken off, right? And so when I started buying them getting them in our CSA, I wasn't sure what to do with them, and so I ended up putting them in, a savory oatmeal. I ended up pickling some or making kimchi with some. So byproducts that we don't normally use. Things that are overripe or past their expiration date, I put it in quotes because there isn't really a set, an expiration date kind of standard. There are things like best by dates, right? If you read labels on your, canned goods, packaged goods, you will see best by or sell by or use by or other things. It won't say expires on this date. And those dates are really just for quality assurance. Like it basically is a mean to say, the store should sell this milk by this date because it's going to go bad if the average person takes a couple of weeks to go through a gallon of milk, it'll probably go bad if the store doesn't sell it by this date. Or if you're buying it, eating a bag or a chips, they'll probably say best by or certain date a couple of years into the future, because after that date, it's still fine to eat, but it's going to be pretty stale, right? So those aren't really safety recommendations, as it's more of a quality kind of recommendation. And then safety, we do throw away food, if we are obviously haven't held it to the correct temperature for a long period of time, and that's really important too. It's okay to throw away food sometimes for those conditions, especially for those conditions, right? We do want to be safe and not give ourselves food poisoning. So what I have here are just 6 tips, and I'll try to keep it brief. I know I tend to ramble and talk a lot because I really love these topics. 6 tips for reducing consumer food waste. And this is a picture of the EPA's food recovery hierarchy. So we use this kind of as a template for what I do with dining services, is that we try and reduce the amount of food we generate, just really produce enough to feed the students. And then anything that is still safe, we do donate it to the Community Action Center here in Pullman to feed individuals who use that service or their food pantry. And then kind of as a last resort, the food we can't donate and can't use will go to the compost facility on campus. So we definitely try to avoid the landfill with our food waste in dining services as much as possible. And it's something you certainly apply to your own life as well. If you have animals, certainly to use your food scraps to feed animals and other things. Number 1 is, I want to start off with this one because I want to be realistic. And this has to deal with source reduction, right? Reducing the food waste at the source by not producing or not buying it in the first place, right? So really ask yourself, do I need to make a grocery trip? Can I just use stuff we have at home to make our meals, right? Because sometimes it just takes you not going to the grocery store to reduce waste because you're not buying the stuff in the first place. Do you actually need to buy that? Is it just an impulse purchase because it looks really good? Are you really going to use it when you get home? Are you actually going to eat all the food you plan on preparing? And I mention this because I think about Thanksgiving and how you know, how much that holiday is based around food, and everybody, you know, makes this huge meal, and if you don't know how to store it properly, it can go bad pretty quickly, and a lot of it may get wasted because it's just a lot of food, even if it's for a lot of people. So being very careful with those things and cognizant of the fact that some of that may go to waste if you don't plan ahead and are careful with, you know, the storage and planning ahead to freeze and preserve certain things. And I put pictures of cherries because last year my partner and I went to the cherry orchard in Troy, Idaho, and picked 40 pounds of cherries just because, you know, it's hard to kind of measure how much you're picking and how much do you need. So it took us 3 days to can all those cherries, and we froze them, and we didn't waste any of them. They all eventually got preserved. We made a lot of jam. We made some canned cherries. We still have some from last year. But again, you know, being realistic and saying, you know what, am I really going to can all these cherries? Am I really going to have the time to do all this? Even though it sounds very exciting to buy all these cherries and preserve them and sounds fun, but do I really have the time to do that? It was a lot of work. This year, we only picked 20 pounds. So something less. That's one example. Get organized. I mentioned this earlier. We go by what's called FIFO in the food service business, first in, first out rule. So if you buy something new, make sure it goes to the back of the fridge and pull out, you know, let's say it's a carton of milk, make sure the new carton of milk goes to the back and the old one goes to the front, so that the first one, the one in the front, gets used first. I normally just practice this by whenever we, let's say, for example, today's Tuesday, we're going to get a CSA delivery of new produce. I have, you know, most refrigerators have two crisper drawers in the bottom. And so one drawer is for last week's produce that we need to use up, and one drawer I will empty every Monday or Tuesday for the new produce, so that I know which drawer is the one I need to prioritize using first, and then which drawer I can kind of let sit for a little bit. I'll do that with the shelves in the fridge as well. Like I'll have a kind of use it section of the fridge. That's all the front section saying, you know, we need to use this, this, and this this week. And so that when I open the fridge, or my partner opens the fridge to make dinner, he'll see that, you know, this is what needs to be used up. And this is what to prioritize using to make dinner with. Labeling, if you make a lot of homemade items, just so you know when you prepared that, and maybe have a sense of when that needs to be used by. And I'll have some links later on how to look that kind of stuff up. These are just pictures of things that examples that I've mentioned. Yesterday, this one on the top left is yesterday's dinner. I just made a stew out of everything we had from the CSA from last week. Made a little curry and coconut rice, this pickled beet greens, and this is scallion pancakes I made with leftover scallions. So really, if you don't have ideas on how to use certain things, right, I'll mention some sites later on how to help find those recipes. Get creative with your abundance. So if you've been to my sessions before, I mentioned this website quite a bit. It's supercook.com. So if you have things you need to use up, try plugging them into this website. It's basically a database, or a personal kind of database, where you can store in a virtual pantry what you have on hand and make a list of that, and then that will create a search, like a personal search of all the ingredients you have and what recipes will fit those ingredients. And so you come up with a results list of recipes that utilize all the ingredients you have in your pantry. So that's a great resource. Or sometimes I'll just Google, you know, can I make this with this? And I'll have an idea. Can I make curry with cauliflower? Can I make spring rolls with this? And but I think my preferred methods outside of that is to use things in sort of those anything goes kind of recipes, or non-recipes, I guess. So soups I mentioned, casseroles, things that don't require any sort of, things that are more, I guess, templates, right? So none of these things I really use a recipe for. They're, as far as the vegetables go, I just sort of threw in what I had, right? Spring rolls, I grew up eating a lot of spring rolls. My mom never made them with any of the stuff you see here in this thing, but this is what I had to use, and we needed to use up all our lettuce because we have a lot in our garden, plus the CSA. And then I use some pickled beets. I've used those same kind of vegetables with sushi, even though sushi is traditionally, you know, not very veggie based, because I'm vegetarian. So sushi, right? It's not traditional, but it uses things up. Soup, stews, pestos, stir fries go along those ways. If you use a lot of eggs, or in my case, chickpea flour to make kind of a egg-free version of an omelet, which is a picture. Omelets and frittatas are a great way to use up vegetables. And those are sorts of recipes where anything would go, any sort of vegetable would fit just fine. And then sharing with a friend is also a great way, or a stranger. There are a lot of food sharing sites, not in this city, but a lot of bigger cities have food sharing apps or sites like Olio, which is basically an app where you can post that you have leftover this and that, and somebody can come pick it up. We don't have that implemented in this area quite yet, although that's kind of a dream. But there are certainly sites like Buy Nothing that you can find on Facebook, or just even kind of any sort of marketplace thing where you can post like, hey, I have extra food, or I have a bunch of cherries in my backyard. Do you want to come pick them, right? So sharing with a friend, or even sometimes a stranger, or if you have a friend and you both want to go in a big market box at the farmer's market and buy 25 pounds of apples and split that, instead of having one of you buy it and not being able to use it up. That's a great example of how to sharing it with a friend as well. So this part goes two ways: freeze, dehydrate, can, or pickle, or purchase things that are already pre-frozen or canned if you don't have the resources to do your own canning or freezing. Canned vegetables are just as good nutritiously, just as nutritious as fresh vegetables, right? Same with frozen, because they are frozen and canned at kind of their peak ripeness. So if it does help you prevent food waste to buy canned or frozen produce, that's definitely a great way to get produce without risking the produce going bad in your refrigerator. And then if you want to, you can certainly freeze lots of things like cheese, milk, tofu, meat, vegetables. If you want to freeze your own vegetables, most of them require blanching first before freezing. Bananas, I freeze a lot of bananas for banana bread. If you search how to freeze everything on the Food Network website, it gives a good kind of basic guide to freezing most things. And then if you want to freeze without using plastic, I recommend the Zero Waste Chef. She has a lot of great articles on being zero waste in general, but she has this great article on how to freeze things without plastic by using cookie sheets and freezing things on the cookie sheet, and then throwing the cookie sheet items, whatever you're freezing, into glass jars instead of freezing them directly in the jar. And then if you have a dehydrator or can borrow one, that's a great way to save produce for later. These are dehydrated plums. These are dehydrated morel mushrooms. Pickling is also great. You can either can them pick like this, or just pickle them, and they'll last a little bit in the refrigerator, definitely a lot longer than they would if they weren't pickled. These are pickled apples, so you can pickle basically anything, right? The word my partner invented is it pickleable, which I think is fun to say, but you can pickle a lot of things. Apples, I pickle them in apple cider vinegar, so it's kind of a sweet pickle. This one is cucumbers. I just did this past weekend, and kohlrabi, which is kind of like a Japanese version of a turnip or radish, I think. And then making jam, kimchi. I've made quite a few times, and you can make that with a lot of vegetables as well. And then wait before you toss. I mentioned this site a few weeks ago when I did, I think the stay-at-home cooking one a couple months ago, actually, a food keeper that'll tell you kind of how long foods last in the refrigerator or freezer. In this article, I just have this link here if you want to copy it later, or from the YouTube video, or email me if you want the link on some resources on how to check food before tossing it out. But I usually go with the smell check. If it smells rancid or smells bad, or if I see visible mold on there, right, that's a reason to toss it out. But normally, if it's just past the sell by date or the use by date, it's usually going to still be fine unless it smells bad. Because again, like I mentioned, lots of things will last past their best by date. It's just going to be sometimes lower in quality. And then if it is stale or sour, sometimes you can still use those things safely, like stale bread, right, to make bread pudding, or croutons, sour milk. This is actually not quite sour. It's actually a yogurt that didn't quite set up, and I use it to make sour milk, or like a yogurt-based sweetbread. You can make pancakes with sour milk as well. This one probably I do most often if I have, just for fun, not usually because my avocados are overripe, but just because I like it. But overripe avocado that's gone brown and isn't visually appealing can still be used to make baked goods. Like this is my avocado fudge recipe that I really like, or you can use it in place of butter, 1-to-1 ratio in any sort of baked good. And then any sort of wilted greens can go in pesto. We tried it with lettuce a couple weeks ago, which wasn't my favorite because our lettuce had bolted and it was kind of bitter. But like things like so wilted spinach or kale or chard would be fine in a pesto as well. Using the scraps. So I mentioned pesto already, so I won't really rehash it. But things like though I normally would throw away carrot tops, beet greens, other leafy greens are great for pesto. So if it has like a green top to it, with the exception of rhubarb, which rhubarb leaves are poisonous, you probably can't use it for pesto. If you're kind of being cautious about whether or not they're poisonous, you can certainly Google it. But as far as I know, the only poisonous leafy green is the leaves of rhubarb. Citrus peels, if you want a nice fun project, you can candy citrus peels. I normally do this with oranges, but you could also do it with lemons or lime peels. Basically, the hard part is when you're peeling the actual fruit itself to get the pith out of the actual peel, because the pith is the bitter part and you don't want that in your candied product at the end. I do zest quite a bit, so when I buy lemons, if we're not planning on using the zest, I'll just zest it anyways before I cut it open and then throw it in the freezer for later. I usually throw lemon zest in a lot of things. The lime zest I used yesterday for coconut rice, and then I'll use orange zest too in my granola bars or granola. Adds a nice flavor. This is just pumpkin that I made a couple years ago, a roasted pumpkin, or it was a jack-o'-lantern from a couple years ago. And I used the guts to make all sorts of things, just out of experimentation, and then using the seeds, roasting those seeds, not to waste them. Vegetable scraps can be used, or meat bones can be used to make stock. This fun pink thing was from a couple days ago. I had pickled some beets from a few photos ago. You saw the spring rolls. I pickled some beets for spring rolls, and the pickling liquid ended up being very pink. And rather than throwing it away, I basically just used it in place of vinegar, because it is mostly vinegar anyways, for a salad dressing. And so I mixed it with some tahini, which ends up in this purplish fun color. So that was pretty fun. You can also make curry out of banana peels, which I don't do very often, but it is a thing. I've done it a couple times. I definitely recommend using organic bananas if you're going to do that, or candy citrus peels, just because I'm not really sure about the pesticide residue on the peels, because we normally don't eat them. So just to be safe. And then the kimchi I mentioned earlier. And then kind of as a last resort, I guess, before the landfill, is composting. And composting seems, I think when I first started doing it seemed kind of daunting. But it is the ideal way to, throw away food, because it will decompose in a more ideal environment compared to the landfill, because it does have oxygen and kind of the aeration. So if you do have food scraps that you can't turn into any of those other things that I mentioned, or food waste from, produce that's actually gone bad or is unsafe to eat, think about composting it. And sometimes if you post, things on social media or community sort of pages on Facebook, you may be able to find a person who can use the compost, or can take even your scraps and put them in their own compost. Unfortunately, we don't have a community composting service in this area, but lots of other cities do. And that's another thing as far as advocacy to kind of try and implement maybe in the future. But composting is not super hard, and I have the small little bucket that I keep under my sink, and we just throw it in there and then throw it in the backyard in our little bigger composting, one of those big round barrels that we have in the backyard. And they're a little expensive. They're probably about $100. But if you do want to kind of invest in a better composting system for your own home, that's a great way to go. And that's really all I have. I don't see any more comments, but I did want to kind of make a call because we are extending some of these Q Connects for the future. I'm open to doing more. I'm just kind of making up these topics based on my own interests, and I think you've seen that I have a wide variety of interests as far as sustainability and zero waste and vegetarian and vegan cooking and nutrition in general. So if you have any suggestions for topics that you want to learn more about as far as kind of DIY or zero waste or any of those things I mentioned, feel free to drop me a line or drop it in the chat right now.